Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to reach your ears. In the autumn of 1854, 37 souls vanished from the quiet roads leading into Millbrook, Connecticut. They were fathers, mothers, children, tradesmen, ordinary people swallowed by the darkness of history. And though the official record blames wolves, bandits, or the merciless winter that followed, the truth is far more insidious. Every one of them had last been seen heading toward a single place: the Hartwell Brothers grist mill on Copper Creek. A mill whose stones never ceased their grinding, even when there was no grain to be found. Imagine it. A 4-story fortress of timber and stone, rising from the bend in the creek like a sentinel of industry. The air around it heavy with the scent of wheat, damp wood, and something else, something metallic, almost sweet, that clung to the clothes of those who labored within. The grinding stones, imported from France at impossible expense, turned ceaselessly, their low thunder echoing across the valley. It was said you could set your watch by the rhythm. And yet, in that steady pulse, in that endless motion, there was a hunger. The Hartwell brothers were not like their father, a God-fearing man who built the mill with honest sweat and prayer. No, Josiah and Elias were of another breed. One a towering brute with eyes of wet slate, the other a restless genius of gears and ratios whose hands never stilled. They were not married to women, nor to community, nor to God. They were married to the mill, to power, to the promise that in the turning of wheels and the grinding of stone, they could harness something greater than grain. Do you feel that chill running through you? That instinct that tells you to look away, to forget this story? That's the reflex of the world you were trained to believe in, the polite lie that industry was built on progress and prayer. But beneath that lie, men like the Hartwells struck bargains. Bargains with silence. Bargains with shadows. Bargains that required payment not in coin, but in flesh. You weren't supposed to know this, and yet here you are, listening. And the question is no longer what happened in Millbrook. The question is, why was it hidden? And why, even now, do the records of that mill resist the light? Millbrook, in those days, was the picture of New England promise. Rolling hills, tidy clapboard houses, gardens bursting with roses and hollyhocks, a white steeple piercing the sky with every Sunday bell. To the eye, it was a sanctuary of progress and decency, the kind of town where nothing unholy could ever take root. But that is how darkness survives, behind a mask of virtue, beneath the sound of hymns and the smell of fresh bread. Evil doesn't announce itself with horns and fire. It whispers through familiar places. It makes its home in what the townsfolk call prosperity. The Hartwell Mill was that prosperity. It stood at the very heart of the valley's lifeblood, grinding grain for 3 counties, employing men, feeding families. Its flour was prized in New York and Providence for being white, fine, and impossibly consistent. Farmers hauled their wagons across miles of dirt road just to see their harvest blessed by its stones. But if you had stood at Copper Creek on a still day, if you had listened with the ear of someone not blinded by commerce, you would have heard more than grinding stones. You would have felt it, a vibration in the chest, like a second heartbeat not your own, as though the mill was alive, breathing, devouring. Josiah, the elder brother, carried himself with the presence of a man who feared nothing. Debt meant nothing to him. He would strip a family of their harvest over a single missed payment and sleep soundly that night. His stare could pin a man in silence, a reminder that the grain was not yours until he said so. Elias, his younger counterpart, lived inside his own mechanical obsessions. He sketched improvements on scraps of wood, muttered ratios under his breath, and adjusted the gears with a tenderness most men reserve for their wives. Together, they ruled not as servants of their father's legacy, but as lords of a machine whose appetite was never satisfied. The townspeople whispered, of course. They joked that the brothers were married to the mill, but behind their laughter was unease. They had seen the windows of that mill catch the light like watching eyes. They had heard the stones grinding long into the night, when no wagon had come to deliver grain. And some, the oldest among them, remembered what their own grandparents had once said. That Copper Creek was no ordinary place. That long before a single wheel had turned, The native Mohegan people refused to walk near its bend, saying the waters ran backward there under certain moons. But progress silences old warnings. Commerce buries myth. And the mill kept turning. Turning when it should have stopped. Turning when there was nothing to grind. Turning as though what it ground was not meant to feed, but to consume. You see, power never arrives in a roar. It seeps. It waits. It tests the limits of how much you will ignore in the name of convenience. And in Millbrook, the people ignored plenty. They ignored the way the Hartwell brothers' fortunes grew while theirs barely scraped by. They ignored the way debts seemed to tighten like snares around families who fell behind. They ignored the way the mill roared even on nights when no wagons approached its gates. Because to acknowledge what was happening meant tearing apart the illusion of safety that kept their little town whole. But one boy did not ignore. His name was Timothy Phelps. 16 years old, restless, braver than he should have been. On an October morning shrouded in mist, he crept toward the creek at dawn, driven by a curiosity he couldn't explain. He said later, though his words were written only in a private letter, discovered decades later, that the sound of the mill in the distance called to him like a voice. Not in words, but in rhythm. A pounding rhythm that matched his pulse, that drew him closer, closer, until he stood at the edge of the gorge. And there, beneath the groan of the wheel and the grind of the stones, he saw something that no one in town was supposed to see. At first it looked like silt in the water, like the creek had grown thick with mud. But then he realized those were not grains of earth. They were fragments of bone. Tiny, pale shards tumbling through the current, catching the light of dawn like flecks of ivory. He would later describe the smell in the air as sweet as bread, but wrong, terribly wrong. Timothy fled, of course. But what does a boy's word weigh against the Hartwells? Who would believe him when the mill fed half the county? Who would dare accuse the very men who kept the town alive? His warnings were met with silence, then laughter, then anger. Wolves, they told him. Bandits, an early frost. Do not stir fear where none is needed. But Timothy knew what he had seen, and in that knowledge he became marked, not only by suspicion, but by the very machine he had glimpsed. Because that is how control works. The system trains you not to trust your own eyes, not to believe your own instincts. It makes the truth unspeakable, and those who dare to speak it, they vanish. The vanishings began quietly, like stones dropped one by one into a well. A farmer from Cornwall who never returned from delivering his grain. A widow walking the road at dusk, seen heading toward the creek and never seen again. Then a child, no more than 8, who wandered too close to the gorge while playing. At first, no one connected the dots. It is easier, always, to believe in random misfortune than in a pattern too dreadful to name. Wolves, they said. Bandits on the road. An accident, perhaps. The human mind clings to the simple explanation because the alternative, that something deliberate is feeding, cannot be borne. But patterns do not care for human comfort. They continue unbroken until someone is forced to look. By the end of autumn, 37 names had been whispered in back rooms and written in church registers as missing. 37 lives erased. 37 families left with questions they could never ask aloud. And yet the Hartwell mill kept grinding, its low thunder echoing across the valley, a reminder that life, if you can call it that, must go on. And here is the truth most men never face. Communities will sacrifice individuals to preserve the illusion of stability. They will trade silence for order. They will let the machine devour their neighbors, as long as their own children still eat bread. That is how systems of control endure, not because they are hidden, but because they are tolerated. The Hartwell brothers did not need to terrify their town into obedience. They needed only to keep the wheel turning, to keep flour flowing, to keep the people dependent on what their mill produced. Hunger is the strongest leash of all. But not everyone kept silent. A few whispered their suspicions in the tavern after too many drinks. Some claimed they heard screams carried down the creek at night, twisted into the grinding of the stones. Others swore they had seen shapes moving in the mill windows after midnight. Shapes too large, too wrong, to be any man. These whispers spread like rot, poisoning the town's forced optimism. And once fear took root, there was no turning back. The vanishings escalated. The millstones never slowed. And the townsfolk, caught between terror and dependence, did what every society does when faced with forbidden truth. They looked the other way and prayed that the shadows would choose someone else next. Behind the mill's clapboard walls, behind the steady roar of the wheel and the thunder of stone on stone, the Hartwell brothers were not merely grinding wheat. They were building something else, something no one in Millbrook would have had the language to name. Josiah, the iron-fisted elder, and Elias, the restless mechanist, had transformed their inheritance into a sanctum, not of industry but of control. Every gear, every pulley, every turning belt had been altered, adjusted, perfected, not for efficiency of flour, but for efficiency of extraction. You see, Elias had studied briefly at the Sheffield Scientific School, where whispers of new sciences circulated among restless minds. Phrenology, mesmerism, galvanism, the tools of a new age that promised mastery over flesh and mind alike. He returned to Millbrook not only with sketches of gears, but with books he never showed his neighbors. Books that spoke of vibration, of resonance, of how the grinding of stone could be made to reach not only ears but bones, blood, and thought itself. The mill under his hand became an instrument, not of production, of transformation. Josiah supplied the will. He was not a man of theory, but of appetite. Where Elias obsessed over ratios and angles, Josiah obsessed over results. He demanded more than grain, more than profit. He demanded dominion, and together they found a way. By night, when no wagons arrived and no eyes were watching, the stones turned for other purposes. What passed beneath them was not wheat, but flesh. What was sifted was not flour, but ash. And yet even that was not the true harvest. The true harvest was energy, fear, submission, the raw, invisible force that pulses through every human life, waiting for someone ruthless enough to claim it. This is the part no one in Millbrook could face, though some felt it in their bones. The Hartwells were not merely killers. They were engineers of control. They discovered what every tyrant, every priesthood, every empire has always known: that human beings are the most valuable fuel on earth. More than coal, more than grain, more than gold. A single terrified soul can feed the machine of power better than 1,000 acres of wheat. And so, the millstones turned, and the people vanished, and the town whispered its excuses. But in the shadow of Copper Creek, the Hartwell brothers were proving a principle as old as civilization itself: that industry and sacrifice are always bound together, and that progress often grinds more than grain. The Hartwell brothers understood something most men never dare admit. Control does not require chains or whips. It requires compliance. And compliance is born not from force, but from psychology. The brothers did not need to brandish weapons or drag people into the mill by night. They simply had to ensure that the town could not imagine life without them. When you own the bread, you own the body. When you own the body, you own the mind. Millbrook's people convinced themselves that the disappearances had other causes: wolves, bandits, harsh weather, anything but the truth. They went to church, recited prayers, and avoided speaking of the mill after dark. But silence is a prison, and the Hartwells knew it. Josiah would walk down Main Street with deliberate steps, nodding just enough to remind each family that he held their harvest, their livelihood, their survival in his ledgers. His stare said what words did not: "Your life rests on our mercy." And Elias, nervous, muttering, twitching, played another role. The genius tinkerer, the eccentric inventor, the harmless recluse. But behind his darting eyes lay an obsession with resonance. He discovered that fear itself could be amplified, that the rumble of the stones could bend men's nerves, unsettle their dreams, soften their will. Farmers swore that after long days at the mill, they woke with headaches, with tremors, with whispers in their ears that faded when the stones stopped. It was as if the machine was not grinding grain, but grinding thought itself, smoothing out resistance, leaving behind only obedience. Do you understand what that means? The Hartwells were not just predators. They were teachers, pioneers of a principle that has outlived them. You see it today, though you call it by other names: conditioning, propaganda, mass suggestion. The tools have changed. The screens, the wires, the signals. But the lesson is the same. Saturate a man's senses, and you can shape his beliefs. Replace his reality with your rhythm, and he will surrender without ever realizing it. That is the true horror of Millbrook. Not only that 37 vanished into the maw of Copper Creek, but that hundreds more lived under the mill's shadow, convinced they were free, even as they danced to the hum of its stones. And if you think this is just a tale of the past, you are not listening closely enough. The same mill still turns. Different names, different gears, different disguises, but the wheel of control never stopped. The fracture began in whispers. A mother who swore she saw her missing child's red ribbon tangled in the mill's sluice gate. A teamster who claimed he heard voices beneath the grind of the stones. Not screams, but chanting low, rhythmic, as though the very machinery was reciting scripture in a tongue no man should know. A deacon who, one Sunday morning, faltered mid-sermon, sweat streaming down his face, whispering that the mill's hum had followed him into the pulpit. None of them were believed. Belief would have demanded action, and action would have demanded confronting the Hartwells. Instead, the town split. Some clung harder to the brothers, declaring them pillars of Millbrook's prosperity. "Without the mill, we starve," they said. "Without the Hartwells, this town is nothing but a scattering of cabins in the hills." Others avoided Copper Creek altogether, warning their children not to stray too near the gorge, teaching them to hum hymns at night to drown out the distant rumble. But no matter which side they stood on, all were bound by the same leash: dependence. The bread on their table, the coins in their pockets, the stability of their fragile lives, all flowed from the turning of that wheel. Do you see the brilliance of it? Control is never strongest where men are chained. It is strongest where men choose their chains, where they defend their captors because they cannot imagine life without them. The Hartwells had engineered not only a mill, but a psychological cage. The people who hated them could not escape them, and the people who loved them could not admit the truth. That is how power sustains itself, by weaving obedience and denial into the same rope, then tightening it until resistance becomes unthinkable. But fractures spread. A community can ignore one disappearance, perhaps two, but not dozens. The winter of 1854 settled over Millbrook heavy and merciless, and with the snow came silence. 37 names no one dared speak aloud. 37 absences at the church pews, at the supper tables, at the schoolhouse. The air itself seemed heavy, like every chimney in town was coughing out guilt. People stopped asking where their neighbors had gone because they already knew, and still the stones turned, day and night, echoing through the valley like a second heartbeat. A reminder that the Hartwell Mill was more than industry. It was the altar on which Millbrook laid its sacrifices. And once you recognize the pattern, you cannot unsee it. The altar has never disappeared. It has only changed its face. It was inevitable. Fear, like pressure behind a dam, will always find its crack. In late December of 1854, after yet another farmer vanished on the road to Copper Creek, the town reached its breaking point. A small band of men gathered in Garrett's tavern, their faces pale, their mugs untouched. They were not drunkards or dreamers. They were men who had buried too many empty coffins. Timothy Phelps was there, trembling but resolute, telling again what he had seen in the water. The fragments of bone, the sweet stench that clung to the mist. And this time, his words did not dissolve in laughter. They hardened into resolve. The men swore an oath. They would march to the mill by night, confront the Hartwells, and put an end to the vanishings. They carried rifles, axes, even farm tools sharpened to crude points. They were not soldiers, but desperate fathers, sons, and brothers. The plan was simple: force entry, search the mill, and drag the truth into the open. They believed, naively, that evidence would free them, that if they could show the town what the mill truly was, the spell would shatter. But power is never so easily confronted. The Hartwells had been expecting resistance. That night, as the men crossed the frozen fields toward Copper Creek, they heard the mill before they saw it, louder than ever, a droning roar that seemed to crawl beneath their skin, shaking their bones, dulling their courage. Some faltered. One vomited into the snow. Timothy urged them onward, but their hands shook, their eyes blurred. By the time they reached the gorge, the water wheel turned with an unnatural speed, spraying icy mist that burned their throats like smoke. They entered anyway, and what they found inside was worse than their fears. The gears did not merely turn, they pulsed. The belts did not merely spin, they writhed. Grain bins stood empty, yet the stones screamed as if grinding flesh. On the floor, scattered like discarded husks, lay the remnants of what they had come to find. Buttons, shoes, scraps of cloth. Not bodies, never bodies. Only traces, as if the machine had swallowed everything else. Most men fled. Their oath dissolved in terror, their courage ground down by the same rhythm that had consumed their neighbors. Only Timothy remained, frozen in place, watching as Elias Hartwell emerged from the shadows, his hands stained with something that was not flour. And with a voice as calm as prayer, Elias whispered, "Asterisk, the mill does not take. It transforms." Asterisk. That night, no uprising shook Millbrook. No revolution freed the town. The men returned home silent, broken, unwilling to speak of what they had seen. And in their silence, the Hartwells grew stronger. Because nothing empowers darkness more than failed defiance. Timothy Phelps did not sleep after that night. He could not. The images clung to him. The spinning gears that seemed to breathe. The fragments of lives scattered across the mill floor. Elias Hartwell's whisper that felt less like words and more like a brand seared into his mind. He told himself he would not be silenced. He would speak. He would warn. But what does a boy's voice weigh against the hum of a machine that holds an entire town in its rhythm? He tried. At first to his parents, who hushed him, begged him not to repeat such dangerous tales. "Do you want them to come for us?" His mother whispered, eyes wide with terror. Then to the pastor, who shook his head and muttered that the Lord tests his flock in mysterious ways. Finally, to the sheriff, who stared at him coldly and said, "Son, I suggest you forget what you think you saw." Timothy realized then what every man eventually learns. Authority is never neutral. It bends to power. And in Millbrook, power wore the faces of Josiah and Elias Hartwell. But something in him refused to bend. He began keeping a journal, writing by candlelight, recording every detail, every suspicion, every tremor in the air when the millstones turned. In his words there is a desperation, but also clarity. He writes that the mill was an engine not of industry, but of extraction, that it takes not wheat, but the essence of man and feeds upon it. No one in Millbrook would read those pages while he lived. They were hidden, bound in leather, discovered decades later in the ruins of his family's attic. But in 1854, those words were a secret only he carried. And secrets like that weigh heavy. The Hartwells knew. Of course they knew. Power always senses the ones who resist. Timothy began to feel it. Eyes watching him from the windows of the mill when he passed. The rhythm of the stones growing louder when he drew near, as if calling his name. He dreamed of grinding wheels, of endless corridors filled with faceless men marching into the maw of the machine. He would wake drenched in sweat, the hum still in his ears, and know the dream was not only his. It was the mill's. And so Timothy Phelps became marked, not by choice but by destiny. He was the witness. And in places like Millbrook, witnesses do not survive long. When a system wants someone erased, it rarely uses open violence. No, open violence breeds martyrs. Instead, it uses isolation, whisper campaigns, social death. And Timothy Phelps, barely 16, felt the jaws of that machinery close around him. Neighbors who once greeted him on Main Street turned their eyes away. Friends stopped calling his name. Even the girl he had courted at the harvest dance was forbidden by her parents to see him. He was not imprisoned in a cell. He was exiled in plain sight, shunned as if he carried a plague. This is how control sustains itself, by teaching the masses to enforce silence on its behalf. No sheriff needed to knock on Timothy's door. No decree needed to be read. The town itself became the enforcer, terrified of attracting the mill's gaze. and in their fear, they delivered him into isolation. He was alone. Yet still he wrote, scribbling by lamplight, recording truths that no one wanted. His journal entries grew frantic. One passage reads, Asterisk, I feel the wheel turning inside me, as though each beat of my heart is not mine, but theirs. They are in my sleep. They are in the air I breathe. What if the mill is not in the valley, but in us all? Asterisk. The Hartwells, meanwhile, played their roles with precision. Josiah strode through town as always, ledger under arm, his heavy boots pounding out the rhythm of ownership. Elias remained hidden, muttering in the shadows, his hands smeared with grease and something darker. They did not confront Timothy directly. They didn't have to. The hum of the stones grew louder every night, as though the entire machine was waiting, patient, inevitable. Then came January. Snow piled deep along the creek, muffling the valley in silence, except for the mill. It roared on, louder than ever, shaking icicles from the eaves, rattling window panes across town. And one morning, Timothy was gone, his bed untouched, his journal left open on his desk, the ink of his final words still wet. Asterisk, if I disappear, know this, the wheel never stops, and the hunger is not only theirs, it is the world's. Asterisk. The town did not search. Not truly. They mumbled condolences, offered empty prayers, and looked to the ground when Josiah passed by. Timothy Phelps became the 38th. Another sacrifice swallowed. Another silence sealed. And in that silence, Millbrook learned the lesson every captive society eventually learns. Resistance is punished not only by your rulers, but by your neighbors. Millbrook might seem like an isolated tragedy. One town, one family of predators, one cursed mill. But that is the lie of history. To pretend horrors are accidents, local, contained. In truth, Millbrook was not the exception. It was a rehearsal. The Hartwells were not geniuses conjuring methods from nothing. They were imitators, perfecting a rhythm as old as civilization itself. Do you think empires are built with armies alone? No. Armies conquer. But control, that invisible cage around the human mind, is crafted with subtler tools. The Romans had their bread and circuses. The Inquisition had its sermons and rituals. In Millbrook, it was the hum of grinding stones. Different centuries, different faces, same mechanism. Saturate the senses, erode resistance, and replace reality with obedience. The Hartwells were provincial men, but they had stumbled into a universal principle. Elias understood it in his bones. He wrote notes, fragments that survived in water-stained ledgers, hidden away until collectors unearthed them decades later. He called it resonant conditioning. He believed fear could be carried on vibration, that repetition could overwrite thought. If that sounds fanciful to you, consider this. Modern laboratories call it entrainment. Advertisers call it messaging. Rulers call it order. The names change, but the effect is constant. To bend a population not by breaking their bodies, but by grinding their minds until resistance feels impossible. And Josiah, he grasped the other half. Control is not only about rhythm, but about need. He ensured that every bushel, every sack of flour, every coin of credit passed through his ledgers. He starved some, fed others, and taught the town that survival meant obedience. Do you see the elegance of it? Elias worked on their minds, Josiah on their bellies. Between them, the Hartwells forged a cage with no bars. So when you look back on Millbrook, do not imagine a single cursed mill. Imagine instead a model, prototype, a lesson that others have carried forward. From the company towns of the coalfields, to the factories that swallowed immigrant lives, to the glowing screens that feed you your reality today. The Hartwells are there, still grinding, still humming. The horror of Millbrook is not that it ended. It is that it never ended at all. Millbrook did not survive. By the 1870s, the town was a husk. Its young men dead or vanished, its farms depleted, its women widowed into silence. Floods and fire finished what the mill had begun, and eventually only ruins remained. On paper, the Hartwells vanished with it. But power does not disappear, it migrates. And the Hartwells, or those who carried their knowledge, slipped seamlessly into the veins of America's growing machine. Think of the timing. The nation was rebuilding after the Civil War, factories rising like fortresses, railroads carving arteries across the continent. Men with vision and cruelty were needed. Men who understood how to keep workers docile, how to turn hunger into loyalty, how to make resistance dissolve before it could take form. The Hartwells, or their disciples, found a new stage. You will not see their names in gilded history books, no monuments, no portraits. But if you read the margins, the ledgers, the footnotes, you find echoes. A mill foreman in Pennsylvania with the same obsession for resonance. A steel baron in Ohio whose records show unexplained disappearances of Union agitators. A patent filed in 1878 describing a harmonic induction engine that hums eerily like the Copper Creek Mill. This is how legacies spread, not through bloodlines alone, but through principles. The Hartwell's principle was simple: grind down resistance without ever naming it. Make obedience feel natural. Make survival itself the leash. And so the curse of Millbrook was not bound to that gorge in Kentucky. It became embedded in the very fabric of American industry, in the architecture of factories, in the discipline of schools, in the cadence of sermons and speeches. Do you think it coincidence that workers in the Gilded Age spoke of machines that ate men? That miners described the earth itself as hungry? That so many towns across America carry stories of vanishings, silences, whispers that echo Millbrook's fate? No, those are not coincidences. They are ripples of the same stone thrown into history's river. And here is the bitter truth: we celebrate it. We call it progress. We praise the titans who built their empires on bone and breath. We forget the mills and the men consumed, because forgetting is easier than remembering. But the hum has never stopped. It has only changed pitch. The lie they sold us is this: that the past is dead, that the millstones stopped turning when the last beam of the Hartwell mill collapsed into the creek. But listen closely to the world around you and you will realize the hum is still here. It doesn't come from wooden gears or water wheels anymore. It comes from the circuitry of the devices in your hand, from the fluorescent lights in your workplace, from the low drone of engines that never sleep. The hum has been modernized, electrified, digitized, but its purpose remains the same: to lull, to numb, to grind down the human spirit until all that remains is compliance. The Hartwells were only early practitioners of a system that has become the blueprint for modern power. Today, you are told where to stand, how to think, what to consume. Not with chains and whips, but with rhythms and rituals disguised as normal life. The workday is not a natural rhythm. It is a manufactured beat, engineered to keep you in sync with the machine. The school bell, the factory whistle, the smartphone notification, they are all descendants of the same mechanical language the Hartwells used to command a town into silence. And when men resist, when they awaken and begin to see the gears grinding their own lives away, what happens? The system consumes them. Not with public executions or vanished bodies, though sometimes even that still happens, but with quieter annihilation. Careers ruined, reputations shredded, bank accounts drained, families broken. They call it coincidence. They call it failure. But in truth, it is the same ritual sacrifice, the same grinding down of human resistance that Millbrook once knew. You are not meant to recognize this pattern. You are meant to dismiss it as paranoia. But here you are, listening, seeing the shape of the shadow. And once you hear the hum, you cannot unhear it. You will notice it everywhere. In the endless scrolling of screens, in the mandatory repetition of slogans, in the way silence has become dangerous while noise has become mandatory. The Hartwells are gone in body, but their doctrine thrives. Power is not maintained through force alone. It is maintained through rhythm, through grinding, through the illusion that the wheel must never stop. And as long as the wheel turns, men forget they are being fed into it. You have likely felt it already, that gnawing suspicion that the hum is not just a sound, not just a trick of machines or the drone of routine. No, it is a ritual, a rite performed in plain sight. The Hartwell Mill was never just an engine of commerce. It was an altar. Every body that disappeared was not an accident, nor merely a means of control. It was an offering. The stones turned not only grain into flour, but flesh into silence, fear into power. And that power did not vanish into the creek. It was harvested, stored, redirected. Understand this: institutions do not last centuries because of good bookkeeping. They last because they feed. The church bells that rang over Millbrook were not calling men to worship. They were harmonizing with the stones. The town meetings, the processions, the rigid schedules, all synchronized offerings. Rhythm is not just discipline, it is invocation. When masses of men live, breathe, and move in unison, something stirs. Something ancient. Something hungry. This is why governments thrive on parades, on pledges, on rituals repeated until the tongue moves without thought. Why corporations bind you to slogans, jingles, and corporate creeds. Why the very structure of your day is chopped into predictable blocks, bells and alarms shaping your life like the grooved teeth of a great invisible gear. Each motion is energy harvested. Each routine is worship disguised as labor. And every ounce of resistance you fail to muster is swallowed by that same endless rhythm. Think of the missing in Millbrook not as victims but as currency. Their lives were ground down into influence, wealth, and dominion. And when you begin to see the same pattern today, you will understand why everything you do feels drained of vitality, why progress feels hollow, why freedom itself feels like a script someone else wrote. You are inside the ritual, and the ritual does not care if you believe in it. Here is the revelation. The hum is the voice of the altar, and the altar never stopped. It has changed its face, stone wheels to steel, steel to circuits, circuits to data streams. But its appetite remains the same. What you call the system, what you call progress, what you call society, these are just new masks on an old hunger. Now you see it. The Hartwell brothers were not anomalies. They were initiates, early architects of a design that still consumes you today. The millstones that ground more than grain have been reborn into the engines of your world. Your phone, your job, your bank account, your obligations, all are gears in the wheel. And you, without ever realizing, are the grain. This is the descent no one warns you about. Once you recognize the ritual, once you hear the hum for what it is, you cannot return to sleep. The comfort of ignorance is gone. The shadows sharpen. The world reveals its hidden mechanics. And you feel both terror and power in equal measure. Because here's the forbidden truth, the same one the Hartwells stumbled upon when they realized they could grind flesh into influence. Those who recognize the wheel can learn to stop being its fuel. But there is a price. To resist the hum is to stand apart from the crowd, to sever the rhythm that others call normal life. You will feel alone. You will feel hunted. You will feel the machine press harder, trying to grind you back down into obedience. Yet if you endure, if you hold steady against its pull, you become something the system cannot digest. A man who cannot be ground down. A man who stands outside the ritual. A man who sees. This is why you were drawn here. Not for entertainment. Not for curiosity. But because somewhere inside you already knew, you were not made to be flour. You were made to break the wheel. And that journey begins not with more knowledge, but with recognition. Recognition that the mill never stopped turning. Recognition that your life is more than labor, more than ritual sacrifice. Recognition that silence itself can be defiance, and defiance itself can be sacred. So I leave you with this choice. Will you continue to walk the road to the mill, head down, body offered to the grinding stones? Or will you step aside, hear the hum for what it is, and claim your place as something more than currency in a system designed to consume you? If you feel the hum, if you are ready to resist it, then write in the comments, ***, the wheel breaks here. The wheel breaks here. Do it twice. Not for me. For yourself. Mark the moment you stepped out of the ritual. Mark the moment you ceased to be grain. Because remember this. Once a man sees the gears turning, he can never again pretend they are not there. The descent is complete. The wheel is exposed. And now you must decide whether you will be ground beneath it or rise above it. You've just taken in a truth most men will never dare to face. You felt the weight of the Hartwell brothers, the mill that never stopped, and the ritual that still grinds beneath our lives. That knowledge is not entertainment, it is initiation. If you made it this far, you are not like the others. You are ready to see what lies beneath the surface. ready to peel back the layers of history and uncover the forces that shape you without permission. So here is what you do next. If you have not already, declare it in the comments. The wheel breaks here. The wheel breaks here. That is your mark, your signal to the algorithm, but more importantly, it is your oath to yourself. The act of writing it binds you into the circle of men who refuse to be ground down. Then subscribe, because this is only the first descent. Each story I reveal is another door, another layer stripped away. You will walk through abandoned asylums, forgotten bloodlines, suppressed doctrines, and the hidden machinery of control that runs from ancient altars to the boardrooms of today. If this one truth disturbed you, imagine what waits behind the next door. And share this with one man you know is ready. Not your whole circle, just one. The hum spreads faster than you think, and every awakened man strengthens the fracture in the wheel. The descent does not end here. It deepens, it sharpens, it consumes. But now you are no longer a bystander. You are marked, aware, awake. The wheel has turned for centuries. Tonight you heard it break.